Chapter 54, which deals with matters relating to this history and no other. The Duke and Duchess resolved that the challenge Don Quixote had, for the reason already mentioned, given their vassal, should be proceeded with. And as the young man was in Flanders, whither he had fled to escape having Doña Rodriguez for a mother-in-law, they arranged to substitute for him a Gascon lackey, named Tosilos, first of all carefully instructing him in all he had to do. 2 days later the Duke told Don Quixote that in 4 days from that time his opponent would present himself on the field of battle armed as a knight, and would maintain that the damsel lied by half a beard, nay, a whole beard, if she affirmed that he had given her a promise of marriage. Don Quixote was greatly pleased at the news, and promised himself to do wonders in the lists, and reckoned it rare good fortune that an opportunity should have offered for letting his noble hosts see what the might of his strong arm was capable of. And so, in high spirits and satisfaction, he awaited the expiration of the 4 days, which, measured by his impatience, seemed spinning themselves out into 400 ages. Let us leave them to pass as we do other things, and go and bear Sancho company, as mounted on Dapple, half glad, half sad, he paced along on his road to join his master, in whose society he was happier than in being governor of all the islands in the world. Well then, it so happened that before he had gone a great way from the island of his government, and whether it was island, city, town, or village that he governed, he never troubled himself to inquire, he saw, coming along the road he was travelling, 6 pilgrims with staves, foreigners of that sort that beg for alms singing, who as they drew near arranged themselves in a line, and lifting up their voices all together, began to sing in their own language something that Sancho could not, with the exception of one word which sounded plainly alms, from which he gathered that it was alms they asked for in their song, and being, as Cide Hamete says, remarkably charitable, he took out of his alforjas the half-loaf and half-cheese he had been provided with, and gave them to them, explaining to them by signs that he had nothing else to give them. They received them very gladly, but exclaimed, "Geld! Geld!" "I don't understand what you want of me, good people," said Sancho. On this, one of them took a purse out of his bosom and showed it to Sancho, by which he comprehended they were asking for money, and putting his thumb to his throat and spreading his hand upwards, he gave them to understand that he had not the sign of a coin about him, and urging Dapple forward, he broke through them. But as he was passing, one of them, who had been examining him very closely, rushed towards him, and flinging his arms round him, exclaimed in a loud voice and good Spanish, "God bless me! What's this I see? Is it possible that I hold in my arms my dear friend, my good neighbour Sancho Panza? But there's no doubt about it, for I'm not asleep, nor am I drunk just now." Sancho was surprised to hear himself called by his name, and find himself embraced by a foreign pilgrim, and after regarding him steadily without speaking, he was still unable to recognize him. But the pilgrim, perceiving his perplexity, cried, "What! And is it possible, Sancho Panza, that thou dost not know thy neighbour Quixote, the Morisco shopkeeper of thy village?" Sancho, upon this, looking at him more carefully, began to recall his features, and at last recognized him perfectly, and without getting off the ass, threw his arms round his neck, saying, "Oh, the devil could have known thee, Quixote, in this mummer's dress thou art in! Tell me, Who has Frenchified thee, and how dost thou dare to return to Spain, where if they catch thee and recognize thee, it will go hard enough with thee? If thou dost not betray me, Sancho, said the pilgrim, I am safe, for in this dress no one will recognize me. But let us turn aside out of the road into that grove where my comrades are going to eat and rest, and thou shalt eat with them there, for they are very good fellows. I'll have time enough to tell thee then all that has happened me since I left our village in obedience to his Majesty's edict, that threatened such severities against the unfortunate people of my nation, as thou hast heard. Sancho complied, and Quixote, having spoken to the other pilgrims, they withdrew to the grove they saw, turning a considerable distance out of the road. They threw down their staves, took off their pilgrims' cloaks, and remained in their underclothing. They were all good-looking young fellows, except Quixote, who was a man somewhat advanced in years. They carried alforjas, all of them, and all apparently well filled, at least with things provocative of thirst, such as would summon it from 2 leagues off. They stretched themselves on the ground, and making a tablecloth of the grass, they spread upon it bread, salt, knives, walnut, scraps of cheese, and well-picked ham bones, which, if they were past gnawing, were not past sucking. They also put down a black dainty called, they say, caviar, and made of the eggs of fish, a great thirst-wakener. Nor was there any lack of olives, dry it is true, and without any seasoning, but for all that toothsome and pleasant. But what made the best show in the field of the banquet was 6 botas of wine, for each of them produced his own from his alforjas, even the good Quixote, who from a Morisco had transformed himself into a German or Dutchman, took out his, which in size might have vied with the 5 others. They then began to eat with very great relish and very leisurely, making the most of each morsel, very small ones of everything. They took up on the point of the knife, and then all at the same moment raised their arms and botas aloft, the mouths placed in their mouths, and all eyes fixed on heaven, just as if they were taking aim at it. And in this attitude they remained ever so long, wagging their heads from side to side, as if in acknowledgment of the pleasure they were enjoying, while they decanted the bowels of the bottles into their own stomachs. Sancho beheld all, and nothing gave him pain. So far from that, acting on the proverb he knew so well, when thou art at Rome, do as thou seest, he asked Quixote for his bota, and took aim like the rest of them, and with not less enjoyment. 4 times did the botas bear being uplifted, but the 5th it was all in vain, for they were drier and more sapless than a rush by that time, which made the jollity that had been kept up so far begin to flag. Every now and then some one of them would grasp Sancho's right hand in his own, saying, Español y tudesqui tutto uno, bon compagno, and Sancho would answer, Bon compagno, giuradi, and then go off into a fit of laughter that lasted an hour, without a thought for the moment of anything that had befallen him in his government. For cares have very little sway over us while we are eating and drinking. At length, the wine having come to an end with them, drowsiness began to come over them, and they dropped asleep on their very table and tablecloth. Quixote and Sancho alone remained awake, for they had eaten more and drunk less, and Quixote drawing Sancho aside, they seated themselves at the foot of a beech, leaving the pilgrims buried in sweet sleep. And without once falling into his own Morisco tongue, Quixote spoke as follows in pure Castilian. Thou knowest well, neighbour and friend Sancho Panza, how the proclamation or edict his majesty commanded to be issued against those of my nation filled us all with terror and dismay. Me at least it did, insomuch that I think before the time granted us for quitting Spain was out, the full force of the penalty had already fallen upon me and upon my children. I decided then, and I think wisely, just like one who knows that at a certain date the house he lives in will be taken from him, and looks out beforehand for another to change into. I decided, I say, to leave the town myself, alone and without my family, and go to seek out some place to remove them to comfortably, and not in the hurried way in which the others took their departure. For I saw very plainly, and so did all the older men among us, that the proclamations were not mere threats, as some said, but positive enactments which would be enforced at the appointed time. And what made me believe this was what I knew of the base and extravagant designs which our people harbored, designs of such a nature that I think it was a divine inspiration that moved his majesty to carry out a resolution so spirited. Not that we were all guilty, for some there were true and steadfast Christians, but they were so few that they could make no head against those who were not, and it was not prudent to cherish a viper in the bosom by having enemies in the house. In short, it was with just cause that we were visited with the penalty of banishment, a mild and lenient one in the eyes of some, but to us the most terrible that could be inflicted upon us. Wherever we are, we weep for Spain, for after all, we were born there, and it is our natural fatherland. Nowhere do we find the reception our unhappy condition needs. And in Barbary and all the parts of Africa where we counted upon being received, succoured, and welcomed, it is there they insult and ill-treat us most. We knew not our good fortune until we lost it. And such is the longing we almost all of us have to return to Spain, that most of those who like myself know the language, and there are many who do, come back to it and leave their wives and children forsaken yonder, so great is their love for it. And now I know by experience the meaning of the saying, "Sweet is the love of one's country." I left our village, as I said, and went to France. But though they gave us a kind reception there, I was anxious to see all I could. I crossed into Italy, and reached Germany, and there it seemed to me we might live with more freedom, as the inhabitants do not pay any attention to trifling points. Everyone lives as he likes, for in most parts they enjoy liberty of conscience. I took a house in a town near Augsburg, and then joined these pilgrims, who are in the habit of coming to Spain in great numbers every year to visit the shrines there, which they look upon as their Indies, and a sure and certain source of gain. They travel nearly all over it, and there is no town out of which they do not go full up of meat and drink, as the saying is, and with a real at least in money. And they come off at the end of their travels with more than 100 crowns saved, which, changed into gold, they smuggle out of the kingdom either in the hollow of their staves or in the patches of their pilgrims' cloaks, or by some device of their own, and carry to their own country in spite of the guards at the posts and passes where they are searched. Now my purpose is, Sancho, to carry away the treasure that I left buried, which, as it is outside the town, I shall be able to do without risk, and to write or cross over from Valencia to my daughter and wife, who I know are at Algiers, and find some means of bringing them to some French port, and thence to Germany, there to await what it may be God's will to do with us. For, after all, Sancho, I know well that Ricotta my daughter and Francisca Ricotta my wife are Catholic Christians. And though I am not so much so, still I am more of a Christian than a Moor, and it is always my prayer to God that he will open the eyes of my understanding, and show me how I am to serve him. But what amazes me, and I cannot understand, is why my wife and daughter should have gone to Barbary rather than to France, where they could live as Christians. To this Sancho replied, "Remember, Ricote, that may not have been open to them, for Juan Tio Piello, thy wife's brother, took them, and being a true Moor, he went where he could go most easily. And another thing I can tell thee, it is my belief that thou art going in vain to look for what thou hast left buried, for we heard they took from thy brother-in-law and thy wife a great quantity of pearls and money and gold, which they brought to be passed." "That may be," said Ricote, "but I know they did not touch my hoard, for I did not tell them where it was, for fear of accidents. And so, if thou wilt come with me, Sancho, and help me to take it away and conceal it, I will give thee 200 crowns wherewith thou mayest relieve thy necessities, and as thou knowest, I know they are many." "I would do it," said Sancho, "but I am not at all covetous, for I gave up an office this morning in which, if I was, I might have made the walls of my house of gold and dined off silver plates before 6 months were over. And so for this reason, and because I feel I would be guilty of treason to my king if I helped his enemies, I would not go with thee if instead of promising me 200 crowns thou wert to give me 400 here in hand." "And what office is this thou hast given up, Sancho?" asked Ricote. "I have given up being governor of an island," said Sancho, "and such a one, faith, as you won't find the like of easily." "And where is this island?" said Ricote. "Where?" said Sancho. "2 leagues from here, and it is called the island of Barataria." "Nonsense, Sancho," said Ricote. "Islands are away out in the sea. There are no islands on the mainland." "What? No islands?" said Sancho. "I tell thee, friend Ricote, I left it this morning, and yesterday I was governing there as I pleased like a Sagittarius. But for all that I gave it up, for it seemed to me a dangerous office, a governor's." "And what hast thou gained by the government?" asked Ricote. "I have gained," said Sancho, "the knowledge that I am no good for governing, unless it is a drove of cattle, and that the riches that are to be got by these governments are got at the cost of one's rest and sleep, aye, and even one's food, for in islands the governors must eat little, especially if they have doctors to look after their health." "I don't understand thee, Sancho," said Ricote, "but it seems to me all nonsense thou art talking. Who would give thee islands to govern? Who would give thee islands to govern? Is there any scarcity in the world of cleverer men than thou art for governors? Hold thy peace, Sancho, and come back to thy senses, and consider whether thou wilt come with me, as I said, to help me to take away treasure I left buried. For indeed it may be called a treasure, it is so large, and I will give thee wherewithal to keep thee, as I told thee." "And I have told thee already, Ricote, that I will not," said Sancho. "Let it content thee that by me thou shalt not be betrayed, and go thy way in God's name, and let me go in mine. For I know that well-gotten gain may be lost, but ill-gotten gain is lost, itself and its owner likewise." "I will not press thee, Sancho," said Ricote, "but tell me, wert thou in our village when my wife and daughter and brother-in-law left it?" "I was so," said Sancho, "and I can tell thee thy daughter left it looking so lovely that all the village turned out to see her, and everybody said she was the fairest creature in the world. She wept as she went, and embraced all her friends and acquaintances and those who came out to see her, and she begged them all to commend her to God and Our Lady his mother, and this in such a touching way that it made me weep myself, though I'm not much given to tears commonly, and faith, many a one would have liked to hide her, or go out and carry her off on the road, but the fear of going against the king's command kept them back. And the one who showed himself most moved was Don Pedro Gregorio, The rich young heir thou knowest of, and they say he was deep in love with her. And since she left he has not been seen in our village again, and we all suspect he has gone after her to steal her away. But so far nothing has been heard of it." "I always had a suspicion that gentleman had a passion for my daughter," said Ricote. "But as I felt sure of my Ricota's virtue, it gave me no uneasiness to know that he loved her. For thou must have heard it said, Sancho, that the Morisco women seldom or never engage in amours with the old Christians, and my daughter, who I fancy thought more of being a Christian than of love-making, would not trouble herself about the attentions of this heir." "God grant it," said Sancho, "for it would be a bad business for both of them. But now let me be off, friend Ricote, for I want to reach where my master Don Quixote is tonight." "God be with thee, brother Sancho," said Ricote. "My comrades are beginning to stir, and it is time, too, for us to continue our journey." And then they both embraced, and Sancho mounted Dapple, and Ricote leant upon his staff, and so they parted. Would maintain that the damsel lied by half a beard, nay, a whole beard. A phrase for lying impudently. Nothing gave him pain. A line from the ballad of Mira Nero de Tarpeia, Duran, number 571. "When thou art at Rome, do as thou seest." Proverb 208. How the proclamation or edict his majesty commanded to be issued against those of my nation filled us all with terror and dismay. The edict Ricote refers to was that published September 22nd, 1609, commanding the Moriscos under pain of death to hold themselves in readiness to embark for Africa at 3 days' notice. The date is significant. It was 6 months after the signature of the treaty that virtually recognized the independence of the United Provinces, and acknowledged the defeat of the Church in the struggle for domination in the Netherlands. The victory of the Netherlanders, in fact, recoiled upon the unhappy Moriscos. The anti-Morisco movement had been hitherto confined to Valencia and the Valencian clergy. But now the priesthood throughout Spain, in their fury at the escape of the northern heretics, took it up and turned it into a popular agitation. Cervantes quotes here some of the stock arguments of the agitators, but in the novel of the Colloquy of the Dogs he gives them in fuller detail. The Church in this instance adopted the usual tactics of the demagogue, and appealed to the stupidity and the cupidity of the masses, frightening them with the bugbear of another Mohammedan invasion aided by these aliens, and pointing out that the Morisco by his industry, frugality, skill, and business-like qualities was everywhere taking the bread out of the mouth of the Christian Spaniard. The real offense of the Moriscos was, of course, that in spite of all the Church could do, from baptism to burning, they still remained unsatisfactory Christians. As Cervantes with exquisite naivete says in the Colloquy, it would be a miracle to find one of them that has a genuine belief in the holy Christian faith. Very likely, it can hardly have gained fervour from the fires of the Inquisition, with Moriscos who remembered their own old faith that for 7 centuries had respected church and synagogue, and left Jew and Christian to worship in peace. The king, a kind-hearted man, bigot as he was, shrank from the wholesale cruelty of the Church proposals, but he was frightened into yielding. For Lerma, resistance would have been an immediate fall from power. The opposition of the nobles was futile. The men who had made Spain a great nation were powerless now against the combined forces of stupidity and fanaticism that were undoing their work. The sufferings of the wretched Moriscos, the massacres of those that resisted, the miseries of those that submitted, are a tale that has been told often enough. And as for the effects on Spain, to quote the words of Don Florencio Janer, who has written one of the ablest and most impartial books on the subject, it may be said that from an Arabia Felix it was converted into an Arabia Deserta. A sad story, and hardly less sad to find noble Cervantes lifting up his voice on the side of the silliest agitation, the stupidest policy, and the cruelest measure that ever history has had to record. We knew not our good fortune until we lost it. Proverb 22. And there are many who do come back to it and leave their wives and children forsaken yonder, so great is their love for it. This is historically true. In 1613 it was found necessary to order a second expulsion of returned Moriscos. We heard they took from thy brother-in-law and thy wife a great quantity of pearls and money and gold, which they brought to be passed. At first a certain amount of property was permitted to be carried away, but ultimately the deported Moriscos were not allowed to carry anything with them. Yesterday I was governing there as I pleased, like a Sagittarius. Sancho's meaning is not very clear here. Sagittarius in the Germania slang is one who is whipped through the streets. Ill-gotten gain is lost, itself and its owners likewise. Proverb 24.